In my previous video about the short sparring, I said how one of the things that killed any chance of that aircraft getting into service was the acquisition by the British of surplus B-29s from the United States. And generally in the histories, that's all you get. Britain needed a nuclear bomber, they got the B-29, and that saw them through while the V-bombers were developed. Indeed, it mirrors the histories generally given of the 5 years straight after the Second World War. Germany and Japan defeated, the Allies settled down for peace, but things with the Soviet Union quickly went downhill, leading to the formation of NATO and the beginning of the Cold War. The 5 years between 1945 and 50 tend to get sort of glossed over, but that is far too simplistic. And the history of the RAF's Washington bombers is a good example of some of the complexities of the period and to the eventual solidifying of the Anglo-American alliance, which gets termed as the special relationship. The end of the Second World War saw the world now have three major powers: Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States. But in reality, there was only one: America. The United Kingdom was essentially broke and about to lose their empire in pieces, while the USSR had suffered huge casualties and devastation in their industrial heartlands from the German invasion. But more importantly, the United States was the only nuclear power on the planet, and they swiftly made moves to try to keep it that way. In 1946, the Atomic Energy Act, also known as the McMahon Act, was passed. Although the Act sought to place controls on a whole raft of issues concerning nuclear power, the most significant one was on sharing atomic secrets with other nations. And for the British, this was bad news. They, along with Canada, had been significant contributors to the Manhattan Project, which had created the bombs used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Indeed, the British firmly considered the new nuclear discoveries to be a joint project between the UK and the USA. To this end, agreements had been reached between Churchill and Roosevelt on continued cooperation on atomic energy and weapons development after the war. With McMahon, that went out of the window, and Britain had to make some tough decisions. Immediately at the end of the Second World War, the British government had slashed the military budget and size, adopting a 10-year policy which concluded that the country would fight no major war in the next 10 years and that the existing stockpiles of weapons would be sufficient for that period, with only limited purchases of certain items, such as new jet fighters, being necessary. The Americans kicking them out of joint atomic development meant that the British either had to be completely beholden to the United States for nuclear power, or else must create their own nuclear weapons from scratch and bombers to carry them. Needless to say, the Brits were pretty upset about McMahon, and it is notable that a month after it passed, the Attlee government gave permission for the export of Rolls-Royce Nene engines to the Soviet Union, where they would go on to be a major part in that nation's military aviation development. Now, I am only speculating that the passing of McMahon and the sale of Nenes has any connection, because the British did have an active economic policy that aviation development was going to be their way of maintaining high-tech industrial exports in the post-war world, and as said, Britain was completely broke. But you must admit, the timing is certainly interesting. All of this is to say that a mere year after the Allied victory over the Axis powers, the special relationship really wasn't looking so special, and tempers on both sides of the Atlantic were somewhat frayed. Fortunately, the Soviets were there to help patch things up. In 1947, the Soviets violated the Yalta Agreement, which had guaranteed an unbiased election in Poland, rigging the vote so that the communists would win. They also put increasing pressure on Turkey, including demonstrations of military force so that their naval vessels could access the Mediterranean, as well as sponsored communist forces fighting in the bitter civil war in Greece. This all led President Truman to espousing his doctrine in March 1947, seeking to limit the expansion of communism and Soviet influence, a doctrine that led to the United States adopting a policy of offering military aid to countries under threat, which crystallized in the 1949 Mutual Defense Assistance Act. This would see the US transfer billions of dollars worth of equipment, much of it surplus, to allies. And here we come, finally, to the Washington bomber. By 1949, Britain had some serious problems defence-wise. For starters, and as already said, they were pretty much broke. Despite this, they were spending huge amounts on developing their own nuclear weapons and multiple bombers to deliver them. In addition to this, their existing strategic bombing capability was basically zero. Their principal bomber, the Avro Lincoln, did not have any real capability to strike the Soviet Union should war break out between the Soviet and Western blocs. Considering the importance that strategic bombing played in British military policy, well, that was not great. And so, while the UK was in a reasonable position to supply itself for much of its military needs, it was recognised that it would probably be 1953 at the earliest before the interim Sperrin bomber came into service, and several more before the proper V bombers were available. With concerns that the Soviet Union was becoming increasingly belligerent and the spread of communism after the fall of Republican China that year, the British, then the second strongest military in the new NATO alliance, had no real offensive options. So the passing of the Mutual Defence Assistance Act represented an obvious opportunity. The British had 5 modern jets in development: the Canberra, the Sperrin, the Valiant, the Victor, and the Vulcan. The viability of the Sperrin was already being questioned, as it was always expected to be a much more modest design to act both as a guarantee against the failure of the V bombers and to provide an intermediate type for transitioning to the more advanced Victors and Vulcans from the obsolete Lincoln. But with the United States having a fleet of largely unused B-29s sitting around, the opportunity to request these as military assistance was eminently logical. Sure, the B-29 was not a jet and was technically an older design than the Lincoln, but it was far more capable and, importantly, had the ability to carry a useful payload out to a greater range, once again giving the RAF the ability, albeit limited, to have once again a strategic bombing capability aimed at the Soviet Union. The acquisition of B-29s would also allow for the Sperrin to be cancelled, allowing money allocated to be funneled into other bomber projects, a much better use of precious capital resources. However, despite the common sense of this, it wasn't all plain sailing. Amongst the British establishment, there was minor horror that the nation's own resources had failed to provide an indigenous bomber, and concerns that the Americans might use the supply of B-29s as leverage on British policy. Speaking in the House of Commons, the Conservative MP John Profumo stated that the time may come when we may wish to act on our own and to use our own initiative in starting action. And when action has been started, we want to know that our chiefs of staff can give orders without the by your leave of any foreign country. Yes, the irony that it was Profumo who was making these comments on fears over British security are not lost on me, but considering what happened a few years later with the Suez Crisis, he wasn't exactly wrong. Plus, there was a fair bit of dissent on supplying B-29s to the British from the American side as well. During the hearings to discuss the transfer, Congresswoman Helen Gahagan of California stated objections to the deal on the grounds that the British were selling Land Rovers to Argentina, which cut into sales of American Jeeps. This was followed up by Congressman John Vorris of Ohio, who wanted to know why America was supplying aid to Britain when British jets were being licensed produced in France, again at the expense of American designs. As he put it, we cannot be pouring arms into Europe and having any of them selling any of that stuff to create dollars or anything else. There was also, as several British politicians feared, talk of using the supply of B-29s to influence British policy. Senator McMahon, yes, him of the aforementioned Atomic Act, suggested that the US should wring an agreement out of Britain to cancel their nuclear weapon program in exchange for the aircraft, indicating that he didn't seem to understand why the RAF wanted them in the first place. And Senator Arthur Vandenberg of Michigan spelled it out even more bluntly when he said that it was, quote, inconsistent for the British to spend $2, $3, or $400 million on atomic energy and request military aid. Again, the Soviets helpfully snuffed out these objections when they conducted their first nuclear bomb test in August 1949. From that point, things proceeded rather quickly, and the RAF took delivery of their first B-29s, service designated as the Washington B.1, in March 1950, making the British the only export customer for the B-29, except for 2 aircraft subsequently supplied to the Australians by the RAF. But like so much else about the Washington bomber, its service wasn't particularly smooth either. The initial plan had been that the RAF would take on 70 B-29s up to March 1951, with another 124 the following year. But these aircraft were all in storage and first had to be brought back to flight status and upgraded, principally with the fuel-injected Wright R3350-57M engines. Problems began pretty much immediately when there were issues at the Curtiss Wright plant that was contracted to conduct the refurbishments, revolving mainly around poor management and labour disputes. And then, towards the end of June 1950, North Korea invaded the south, sparking the Korean War. Suddenly, the US Air Force needed all of their resources as a massive military expansion took place, and the B 29s were employed heavily in the conflict by the USAF. This saw the numbers supplied to the British cut to just 87, as well as major complications on the supply of spare parts. All of this meant that the RAF's plans for Bomber Command to regain its teeth had to be scaled down a fair bit, and in total only 8 squadrons were equipped with the type. This was not enough for the sort of city-busting campaigns that the RAF had conducted against Germany during the war, so the RAF decided that in the event of war with the Soviet Union breaking out, they would instead focus on attacking Soviet airfields, principally bomber bases. And this gives a clue to answering one of the questions that is still asked about the Washington. Was it ever actually an atomic bomber? It is often written that the Washington B.1 served as the RAF's nuclear bomber until the V-bombers came into service from the mid-1950s onwards. But the British didn't actually field their own nuclear bomb until November 1953. Sure, B-29s could use American-supplied weapons, and it is conceivable that, had the balloon gone up, the US would have supplied atomic bombs to the RAF for use against the Soviet Union. But despite talks on the issue, no agreement was ever reached, and so the capability of the Washingtons to act in a nuclear role remains at best speculative and, in reality, unlikely. As it was, the aircraft were mainly used by the RAF to fulfill their intended role of giving the service a strategic, if conventional, capability, giving British crews experience in long-range operations and being used to test Britain's own defences against intruders. These exercises showed that the B-29s were highly vulnerable in the face of modern jet fighters without escort, experiences borne out by the Korean War. On top of this, the Royal Air Force had severe problems keeping the aircraft in service. As part of the agreement on their supply, the British needed to create an indigenous repair and overhaul capability, and these were promptly established, with the Bristol Aeroplane Company getting the contract to maintain the engines for the Washingtons. But the Korean War meant that spare parts became few and far between, and Bristol often had to refurbish engines with worn parts, a practice that meant that the big Wright radials only managed 60 hours of flight between overhauls, in sharp contrast to the 250 hours of United States Air Force aircraft, a factor that significantly impacted on availability rates for the Washingtons. With a number of problems in maintaining them in service, along with the fact that the B-29 was basically obsolete, the service life of the Washington B-1s was understandably short. The aircraft were largely all returned to the United States between July 1953 and July 1954, with a dozen or so scrapped in the UK, while 3 were retained and converted into long-range signals electronic reconnaissance aircraft, as well as a pair transferred to the Australians for trials work. All of these were gone from service by the late 1950s, and that would be that. The end of an aircraft that is barely a footnote in aviation history, and one which had a rather poor track record, both in service and politically, as well as almost certainly never fulfilling the role that history ascribes to it, carrying Britain's nuclear bombs. But the Washington did have one important influence. It laid a new groundwork in cooperation between the United States and the United Kingdom on strategic weapons, especially nuclear. In 1955, a year after the Washingtons effectively left service, amendments to the McMahon Act meant a new period of cooperation in nuclear technology between the two countries could begin. This saw Anglo-American cooperation on Britain's first nuclear submarines, licensed production of American designs for atomic bombs, and ultimately to the US supplying Polaris and then later Trident strategic missiles to Britain. So, while the Washington is nowadays barely remembered, and if anything with scant love by those who had to fly and service it for the RAF, it did in fact play a useful role in re establishing important links between Britain and the United States on their common interests and helping to patch up the rifts that started to occur in the post war period.